Alright, welcome to our next video for U.S. wars. Today we're going to be talking about the entrance of America into World War I. But to kind of set the field for this, you need to know a couple of things, so just going to be going back a little bit here. So, in the last video, I briefly talked about how Russia exited World War I. We talked about the Bolshevik Revolution. Honestly, I wish I could have talked a lot more on that one. That's a fun one to have a discussion on, look at more in-depth stories on. But I'm trying to keep things a little bit shorter, shorter for you guys as you guys are watching these at home. But yeah, the slide you're seeing down the bottom left of the video here, and that's again the last slide that we looked at last time, how Russia exited the war. Now, just in total, when Russia exits the war, a few things happen because of this, things that we've already talked about. In the last video we talked about how when Russia exits the war, at least I think we talked about this, if not, then you're hearing it for the first time here. When Russia exits the war, that frees up millions of Central Power troops, meaning Austrian and German troops. And that's how the border to be reassigned to other parts of the front, namely the Italian and Western fronts. A lot of them go down to the Italian front. By the way, there's big arguments in the higher ups of the German government. Basically, at this point, they're like a military dictatorship. Yes, the Kaiser's in charge, but it's more like Ludendorff is in charge. At this point, the general in charge is a guy named Ludendorff. It's not Falkenhayn anymore. It's not von Moltke anymore. But the argument was, do we send everybody to the Western Front, just overwhelm the Allies, or do we send people down to Italy, overwhelm the Italians, and then overwhelm the Allies? And that's essentially the argument that went out. Let's overwhelm the Italians first. Now, we talked about that with the Caporetto offensive, how that was a disastrous thing for the Italians and how they were barely able to hold on by the skin of their teeth. But basically, a lot of troops also go to the Western Front, and not in this video, but another one we'll talk about the massive attack that the Germans launch against the Allies, the first one being called the Michael Offensive. Now, what saves the Allies' hides at this point is the entrance of America into World War I. Now, America actually joined World War I before Russia exits the war. And it had not to do with this, but it had a lot to do with the Russian Civil War. Not the Russian Civil War, sorry about that. It had a lot to do with the Russian Revolution, the first part of it. If you remember, in the video last time, I talked about how the Russian Revolution is divided up into two parts. You have the February Revolution and you have the October Revolution. I can't remember which months those are, if those are the Russian months or those are our months. I always mix those up. It's either the March and November Revolution or it's the February and October. I'm pretty sure from the Russian side of things it's February and October. Anyways, in February of 1917, Russia turns into a democracy. They actually, in doing so, they asked the United States for help in drafting a constitution and stuff like that. They actually looked to the United States above even Britain and France and say, hey, how'd you guys do this? How'd you set up a free society? And that made us feel a little bit better. And in fact, one of the major things that was a hang-up for the United States getting involved in World War I is, if we get involved in World War I and help out the Allies, well, we're helping out the Russians and they're a monarchy, and we hate monarchies, is kind of the thought process. And I'll get into the reasons why we decided to join, but we joined in April 1917. So between April 1917 and the end of 1917, basically like October, November, December, when Russia basically is pretty much fully pulled out now, we are all there, and it seems like everything is just coming down on Germany pretty good. Like they're about to get squashed because the United States has jumped into this one. And then Russia pulls out, and Germany's like breathing a sigh of relief there. By the way, one of the things I did not talk about in the lesson last time was how Ludendorff specifically smuggled Lenin into Russia. Lenin was not in Russia at the beginning of World War I. He was exiled. He was living in Switzerland, and Ludendorff got him there. and he was hoping Lenin would actually cause a revolution to overthrow the Russian government, to pull them out of the war, and it worked perfectly for him. Now, in the short term it worked perfectly. We're not going to go into long-term stuff, but the short term it worked perfectly for him. That's something I should have explained in the last video, and I'm sorry I didn't, but there you go. Now, moving into, let's switch this up a bit. Moving into America and America's reasonings for joining the war. There are two main reasonings why we joined the war. One you could view as not, or one, let's put it this way. Let's say the first one we could view as one being a great reason to join the war, something that we still kind of tout even to this day, the idea that we want to make the world a safe place for freedom, for the ideas of democracy where the people have control of their lives and the government isn't oppressing them. You know, that's still a reasoning we use to this day, and say getting involved in other areas of the world. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing today, that's a different argument. Just saying that's still a reason that we give today. And the other reason, though, why we get involved in the war, and the one that's actually pushed more in, you see a lot more, I guess, when you read about reasons why America gets involved in the war, is more kind of, how would I put this, it's just viewed, simply put, kind of on the greedy side, or a self-preservation side, that our economy was becoming more and more attached to the Allies winning. If the Allies didn't win, we were going to get hurt economically, where the average American was going to feel it here at home on your paycheck and things like that if the Allies didn't win. And I'll explain more about how that works in a bit. But those are the two main reasonings of why we get involved in the war, and there's no way I'm going to be able to cover in this video all the in-depth parts of that. I highly invite you to look that up yourself, although just be careful the sources you look at and know the sources you're looking at. Please research laterally if you've been taught that yet. Anyways, moving on though. So, in this slide, we need to talk about American understandings. I talked about when we talked about nationalism that America, didn't have the patriotic nationalistic feeling that we have today, where I say things like, if someone asks me where I'm from, they're from a different area of the world, I'll say I'm an American. Well, again, this is a bit of a review from what we talked about last time, but before World War I, a lot of times people would answer with, "Oh, I'm from New York. I'm from Los Angeles. I am from Lehigh, Utah." I wouldn't start with the country first because they're more identified with the area of the country they're in. Now, they identify as Americans in the idea of I live in a land of opportunity. I love the setup and the idea that I can work hard and get somewhere in life, that I'm not told things I can't do. Now, that's overall. Of course, we could talk about different minorities and things like that didn't necessarily have that at this point, like Chinese railroad workers for one. But anyways, just lost my train of thought. Oh, okay. So, Americans had this thought process. Now, that changes World War I. World War I is actually where World War I and then going into World War II, we really get our patriotic and nationalistic mindset. We are all Americans. Yes, we may live in different states, we may live in different cities, but we do have this connectivity that where we feel like we're unified. A sense of belonging, basically. Now, where it says at the top, America's attitude throughout the war was one of isolationism, something we don't really talk about much anymore. We definitely don't push anymore because we're not like this anymore, is isolationist. The idea let the world deal with their own problems, we'll just do our own thing and we'll be just fine. Now, this is something that was pushed a lot for the first half of the life of our country. And it has its roots in what's called the farewell, well, not called, it is the farewell address of George Washington at the end of his presidency. He effectively said, don't get involved in entangling alliances. Don't get involved in European wars. Specifically, don't get involved in European wars. That will drag us down. And this was such a huge mantra to hold to that, this was recited. The farewell address of Washington, at least that part, was recited like the Gettysburg Address is today. It was such a core feeling for all Americans. We are us, you are you, you do your own thing. If you want to screw yourself up, you screw yourself up. We don't have anything to do with it. We're not going to let you drag us down. World War I is where this changes. In fact, one of the things that the not just one, but different administrations do, and I'm not sure which one really kind of put the clamp down on it. I want to say it was FDR. I could be wrong on that one. FDR being Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the World War II president for us. Basically, it's like, we need to get rid of this idea of this isolationist feeling. We need to, feel like we're more part of the world. And since then, basically the World Wars era, we haven't had this idea of isolationism. We've been very involved in the world's affairs. Anyways, just getting off of that a little bit, you need to understand that is a mentality of all Americans going into World War I. This isn't our deal. This isn't our thing. So, now, there was a pro-war sentiment here. Former President Theodore Roosevelt was one of the guys who led the charge on the idea that we need to get involved, and his main argument was this is the idea of making the world safe for democracy. But also one of the underlying reasons why you started seeing more of a pro-war sentiment was, well, here, I'm going to bring up a map really quick, not this, but this. Here's a map of World War I. Allies are in green, Central Powers in orange. Definitely looks like the Central Powers are disadvantaged, and they are. A huge disadvantage. So in some ways, it's impressive they held on as long as they did. But what happens is this: at the beginning of the war, when it really is just more of a European affair, America was fine trading with everybody. We were fine dealing with both sides because our government wasn't going to tell our companies who to trade with. They could trade with the Germans, the Austrians, the French, the English or the British, and the Russians. And later on, when Italy and the Ottomans joined the war, we could trade with the Italians, we could trade with the Ottomans. But just take a good look at the map here, and I'm just going to bring this up where you're just seeing the map only. Look at where the United States is positioned, and look where the Central Powers is positioned. There's no way we get to the Central Powers without going past the Allied powers. So if we have a ship leaving from New York, over here, and it wants to get to Germany up like this, the British have this whole area, the British and French navies have this whole area blockaded off. The British and French also have this whole area blockaded off. The British and French and the Russians have all of this blocked off. There's no way any American company is going to be able to trade their stuff into the Central Powers without getting to the British and the French. And there were cases of the British confiscating materials that were sent to Germany. And so just like, okay, from an American perspective, American business perspective, if that's the way it is, well, Britain, France, are you going to buy these things? And Britain and France started buying all this stuff. So we became economically tied to mostly the British and the French. And they started becoming very indebted to us, where they owed us a lot of money. Because they were, wars are not cheap. This cost a lot of money. And it broke the banks of every country involved, at least in the beginning. Did it break the United States? No, it didn't. But I'm not going to get into that right now. We actually are. We're one of the countries. We're the country that came out of this one way on top, out of World War I. So the other country that actually came out pretty much on top without really any negatives, some, but overall not many negatives, was Japan. But again, we'll be covering that when we get into World War II. But anyways, if you're getting this idea that the Allies are just geographically the easier ones and the better ones to trade with, and if we're willing to do that, well then, great. Of course, if you're from the German perspective, you don't like that very much. You're not gonna like the idea that you can't trade with the United States and get the United States is one of the larger industrial countries or up and coming industrial countries at this point. You can't get into that. Dang it. So, what do you do about that? Start sinking the ships. The Germans have an ace in the hole here, submarine warfare. They've invested in this, they've built into it, no one else has, and it turns out to be an amazing and very advantageous weapon to have in World War I. What you're looking at there is a pencil drawing of the sinking of Lusitania. And I'll explain more about how that works in a little bit. But getting back into, let's see here, this. So, but hopefully I've explained this all right. Just the political setup and the American mindset and the world political setup. Germany's a huge disadvantage, so they have every reason to want to sink our ships. Now, of course, we throw up a fit about that. It's like, how dare you? We're a neutral nation. You can't sink our ships. And Germany's like, all right, we won't sink our ships. But if, what do we do when we think a ship is carrying weapons? And that's where the crux comes in. Okay, is that really just a cruise liner? Is that really just a ship doing trade supplies? There's no war materials in it? You don't know. So the Germans actually came up with something and said, all right, if you're looking at a ship and it is this low in the water, there's no way it would be that low in the water if it was just carrying people and baggage, kind of normal stuff. The only reason it would be about that low in the water is if it had some really heavy ordnance at the bottom. At that point, you can make this is talking to submarine captains in World War I. You can make you can choose or basically make the choice, the decision to say, okay, I think that ship is carrying war ordnance, and you have the right to sink that ship. That is what happens to Lusitania. Submarine captain thought it was too low in the water, so he made the decision to sink the ship. Now, whether or not it was carrying or not, we don't know. You can look that up if you want to. Why we don't know, there's definitely conspiracy theories going around it. I'm going to try not to get into that at this point. But that is the reason why the German submarine sunk that ship, and it did have a lot of Americans on board. Not just, it had a lot of others, like British people and others, whatnot, on board. But there was 100 some odd Americans on board that died. And of course, that did not go over well with the Americans, the American government, or the American people at all. So that became a bit of a rallying cry. Like, how dare they? These people are so immoralistic. Couple that up with the British propaganda that is around a lot in American newspapers of like how the Germans are raping the Belgian girls and stuff like that and doing all those terrible things and shooting innocent people. All this is used to sensationalize this idea that we need to get in there. We need to stop Germany. They're this evil empire that are doing all these awful things. So, but Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at this point, keeps the United States out. In fact, he gets reelected in the year 1916 on an anti-war platform, saying, I kept us out of the war, we're not going to get involved. And he gets reelected again, pretty handily with that slogan. Even with a lot of people like Theodore Roosevelt really hammering him down, saying, you're awful, you're awful, you're awful for not wanting to protect freedom around the world. Now, the second thing that's the textbook thing that's said, like, oh, we got involved also because of the Zimmerman note. And yeah, it is. It's kind of a big deal. And this is kind of a funny one to me. Just mainly because of Germany's reaction. It's kind of those things where, like, Germany gets their hand caught in the cookie jar and, they look up at their mom and it's just like, well, of course I'm taking the cookie. Wouldn't you? So here's basically how it goes. Excuse me. When Germany decided that they just couldn't handle it anymore. One of the things I didn't explain is Germany backed off of the submarine warfare. Like after the Lusitania incident, they back off. Like, okay, we don't want the United States getting involved, so we won't do that. But we keep sending the British and the French stuff, and so like we can't take this. America and all, they don't have their soldiers in the battlefield, but they're supplying our enemies. We like this. We can't let this go on. If we could stop those supplies getting from the British and the French, we'd have a much better chance of winning. So they decide, you know what, we're just going to do it. In 1917, they decide we're going to start unrestricted warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare again. We're going to start sinking all the ships that we think are carrying war ordnance. Not every ship, just the ships carrying war ordnance. So they start doing that. Of course, we're like, what are you doing? And so Woodrow Wilson, he doesn't declare war right off the bat off of that one when they do start sinking our ships here and there. He tries to diplomatically talk about this with the German ambassador. The thing is one of the things that the Germans did is they were thinking, this will probably get the United States in on the war. And so if the United States comes in, we need to neutralize them somehow. And so they decide, let's make a deal with Mexico. And so they send a note to Mexico, known as the Zimmerman Note, saying, hey, tell the Mexican government that if they join us in this war against the United States and keep the United States occupied, keep them off of the European battlefields and on their own, like down in Texas and stuff like that, in California, then when we win this war, when the Central Powers win this war, they'll get all the land back that the United States got from them in the Mexican-American War from 70 years before, 60, 70 years before. Now the British actually learned of this, and they let the American government know. They let Woodrow Wilson know. And so Woodrow Wilson, when he was going to meet with the German ambassador to talk to him about the unrestricted submarine warfare, the first thing Woodrow Wilson talks about is, hey, what's this Zimmerman telegram? What is this I heard about it? And the German ambassador sits there and is like, well, that's just insurance. You would do the same thing if you were in our place. And so he totally sticks his foot in his mouth at that point. And well, the rest is history, as they say. Basically, between basically unrestricted submarine warfare, which I really should have up there on that slide instead of saying sinking Lusitania. That really is just a poster child. Big event, yes, but more of a poster child. And then this is a combination of the Zimmerman Note and the idea of just all these atrocities that people have been seeing in the newspapers for the last 3 years now. Because most every paper is more on the pro-Ally side, definitely not pro-German. Even here in the United States, people are starting to change their names. Like if you have German heritage living in the upper Midwest, places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota have huge, to this day, German populations, and people started changing their last names because it became very unpopular to have German last names. For instance, if you have the last name Schmidt, a very German name, you change your last name to Smith, a very English-American name. I shouldn't say American name, but English name. So basically that's where we're at in the year 1917. And America does end up joining the war. And at the same time, Russia is now democratic at that point. So we also have more of that moralistic idea, like we're not helping out some sort of totalitarian monarchy either in winning this war. So we're kind of, well, there you go. Those are the reasons why we decided to get in the war. Although one last thing I will mention though is that we didn't, I should say the U.S. government at the time didn't go out there and say we need to save the American economy and businesses, in all the posters they put up, like the poster you see here. The call to every soldier or every volunteer soldier that goes into the war is, we need to save the world for democracy. That was the rallying cry. Now that was the one they knew that individuals would be more likely to answer to. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. I'm going to be ending this video here in just a second. We're not done with this whole idea, but I'll be ending this video so you don't have to be sitting here for 40 minutes or so. But that comes into play later on. The reason why the average American soldier goes to fight in World War I is to save the world for democracy and protect freedom at home in America as well. Most of them don't really go off thinking, I'm going to save the American economy. So with that being said, I will end it here, and I'll see you in the next video.